The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the rows of identical suburban houses, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. The heat of the day still lingered in the air, thick and unmoving, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. I stood in the garage, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, the scent of oil and dust mixing with the faint aroma of cut grass from a distant lawnmower. It had been a quiet day, the kind where time moved sluggishly. I had spent the better part of an hour organizing the shelves, old paint cans, a box of tangled Christmas lights, and a stack of forgotten magazines. The routine was comforting, a distraction from the thoughts that often crept in when the house was too silent. That was when I heard it, a soft shuffle, barely audible over the faint hum of cicadas. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the house settling, maybe a bird fluttering near the gutter. But then another sound, closer, a creak of the garage door shifting slightly, though I knew I had closed it halfway. I turned slowly, heart tightening just a little, and there he was, standing just at the entrance, half in shadow, was Ethan, my neighbor's son. He was taller than I remembered, his frame lean but strong, the summer heat leaving a sheen of sweat on his tan skin. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his expression unreadable as his gaze flicked around the cluttered space before landing on me. "Hey," he said, his voice deeper than the last time I had spoken to him. I swallowed, setting down the wrench I had been holding. "Hey, Ethan, didn't hear you come in." He smirked slightly, stepping further inside, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. Garage was open. "Thought I'd say hi." I nodded, though something about his presence felt different. I had known Ethan since he was a kid, watched him grow up next door, but the way he stood there now, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes lingering on me a second too long, made the air feel heavy in a way I couldn't quite place. "You need something?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He shrugged. "Not really. Just wanted to talk." There was something deliberate about the way he said it, the words measured. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the evening light framed him, casting long shadows that stretched across the garage floor. Maybe it was the way my own pulse quickened, an inexplicable awareness creeping over me. Or maybe it was the way he was looking at me, like he knew something I didn't. Ethan leaned against the garage wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his body language relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, studying me in a way that made my skin prickle. I forced a chuckle, wiping my hands on a rag. "You just wanted to talk, huh?" He nodded, then glanced around the garage. "Yeah, haven't seen you much lately." It was true. There had been a time when Ethan used to drop by more often, usually with his dad, asking to borrow tools or help fix something. But over the past year, since he had turned 18 and started college, I had barely seen him. He had changed in that time, more confident, more self-assured. And right now, standing there in the dimming light, he exuded something else, something almost deliberate. I turned toward the workbench, pretending to sort through a drawer of tools. "Been busy, I guess. Work life, you know how it is." Ethan stepped closer. "You always working on something in here?" "Yeah, keeps me occupied." He chuckled. "Sounds lonely." That made me pause. I glanced at him, and he was still watching me, his expression unreadable, but laced with something quiet and knowing. "Not really," I lied. Ethan let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "You ever get tired of it?" I frowned. "Tired of what?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Being alone." The words landed like a strike to my chest. I let out a short breath, masking it with a laugh. "That's a deep question for a casual visit." He smirked. "Just curious." I shook my head, turning my attention back to the wrench in my hand, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The air in the garage was thick, and not just from the lingering summer heat. There was something unspoken between us, something I didn't quite know how to name. "I should probably finish up in here," I muttered. But Ethan didn't move. "You ever think about leaving this place?" I furrowed my brow. "What do you mean?" "Like just going somewhere else, starting over, doing something different." I exhaled through my nose, setting the wrench down. "You're young. You're supposed to be thinking about that kind of stuff." "Not me." He stepped even closer then, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. My pulse picked up, an unsteady rhythm drumming against my ribs. "But you do think about it," he said. There was something in his voice, something laced with certainty, like he knew a secret I hadn't even admitted to myself. I forced a chuckle, but it came out shaky. "Ethan, what's this really about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers ghosting over the edge of the workbench. The casual gesture sent an inexplicable shiver down my spine. "I don't know," he said finally, voice low. "I just feel like you're holding something back." I swallowed hard. "I think you're overanalyzing things." He tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "Maybe." A heavy silence followed, the kind that made the walls feel closer, the air feel thinner. I should have said something else, should have changed the subject, should have laughed it off. But I didn't, because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had been holding something back, but admitting it, that was another thing entirely. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze flickering to my mouth for just a fraction of a second too long. I turned away quickly, gripping the edge of the workbench like it was an anchor. "It's getting late." "Yeah," he murmured, but he still didn't leave. The tension between us had shifted, gone from light-hearted banter to something heavier, something almost tangible, and I hated how aware I was of it. I clenched my jaw. "Ethan," but before I could finish, there was a sudden loud thud outside the garage door. The sound made both of us jolt, and the moment, whatever it had been, snapped like a rubber band. I turned toward the door, my pulse still racing, but for a different reason now. The street outside was quiet, the glow of a single streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement. I stepped toward the door, pushing it open slightly. Nothing. Maybe a raccoon? Maybe just the wind? Ethan shifted behind me. "That was weird." "Yeah," I muttered. I shook my head, trying to push away the lingering weight in my chest, the strange heat that had built between us. Whatever had just happened, whatever had almost happened, I needed to forget about it. I turned back to Ethan, forcing a tight smile. "You should probably head home." His expression flickered for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, but then he just nodded. "Yeah, I guess." But as he stepped past me, as he walked toward the garage entrance, he hesitated, just for a second. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, "You know, you don't have to be alone." The words lingered in the air long after he was gone. And the worst part? I didn't know if he meant it as a simple observation or an invitation. The garage felt different after Ethan left. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and I stood there for a long moment, gripping the edge of the workbench, staring at the empty doorway. His words lingered. "You don't have to be alone." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head as if that could rid me of the weight pressing against my chest. It was nothing, just a passing comment. Nothing more. But my body didn't believe that. The warmth of his presence still clung to the air, the echo of his voice settling in my mind like a whisper I couldn't shake. I swallowed hard, pushing the thought away, and reached for the garage door handle to pull it shut for the night. Then I heard it again, a sound, soft, close. I froze. Someone was still there. Before I could turn, before I could process the sudden jolt of adrenaline flooding my veins, I felt it, a presence behind me, a breath, close to my ear. I wasn't ready to leave. I spun around so fast that I nearly stumbled back into the workbench. Ethan stood there, just inside the garage, his expression unreadable, his body half-shadowed in the dim light. My pulse hammered. Jesus, Ethan. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Something about him was different now. Deliberate. This wasn't an accident. My mouth went dry. "What are you doing?" He stepped forward slow and measured. "I don't know." But the way he looked at me said otherwise. There was a weight in his stare, something intense, something that felt like it had been building for a long time, longer than I was willing to admit. I swallowed hard, stepping back instinctively, my shoulder pressing against the cool metal of the tool cabinet. "Ethan, this isn't." "Why do you always do that?" he interrupted. I frowned. "Do what?" He took another step closer. The space between us was shrinking, suffocating. "Act like you don't feel it." My stomach twisted. "Feel what?" His jaw tensed. "This?" The word hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because he wasn't wrong. I had felt it, this strange, unspoken energy between us, the way he looked at me, the way my body reacted before my mind could rationalize it away. I had felt it, and I hated that I had. Ethan exhaled, his voice softer now, more uncertain. I don't get it. You're always alone. You never let anyone in. But when I come around, his gaze flickered over me, searching for something, asking for something. You don't push me away. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to break the intensity of his stare. Because I stopped. Because I didn't have an answer. Or at least not one I was willing to say out loud. A charged silence stretched between us. I could hear everything. The low hum of the streetlight outside, the distant barking of a dog, the soft hitch of Ethan's breath. Then he moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but intentional. His hand lifted, his fingers barely grazing the hem of my shirt, and a shiver shot through me so violently I had to grip the cabinet to steady myself. I should have stopped him. I should have stepped away. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen as his touch lingered. Just for a second, just long enough to make my pulse thunder in my ears. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, Ethan let his hand drop. His breathing was unsteady. So was mine. His eyes searched mine, waiting for something. A reaction. A rejection. A confirmation. And I didn't know what to give him. I should have said something. Should have put distance between us. Instead, I did the worst possible thing. I hesitated. That tiny moment of hesitation. It was everything. Ethan saw it, felt it, and then he leaned in, closer. So close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my jaw. I clenched my fists, my entire body locked in place, my mind screaming at me to move, to say something, to stop this before I couldn't. Then, a sudden crash. A sharp, jarring noise from outside. Something metal hitting the pavement. The moment shattered. Ethan and I both jolted back, the tension between us snapping like a frayed wire. For a few heart-pounding seconds, neither of us moved. Then, with a sharp breath, I turned toward the garage door and stepped forward, trying to collect myself. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I peeked outside. Nothing. Maybe a trash can knocked over. Maybe a stray cat. Or maybe the universe's way of telling me this shouldn't be happening. When I turned back around, Ethan was still standing there, but something in his expression had shifted. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was hurt. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to say something, but he beat me to it. With a strained voice, he muttered, "Forget it." Then, before I could stop him, before I could even process what had just happened, Ethan turned and walked out of the garage. This time, he didn't look back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, utterly alone. The garage felt hollow after Ethan left. The tension that had filled the air minutes ago now settled into something else, something heavier. A lingering presence, an unshakable weight pressing down on my chest. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the open garage door, waiting, expecting him to turn back. But he didn't. I exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down my face. My skin was still warm, still buzzing with the electricity of whatever had almost happened. The phantom sensation of his fingers grazing my shirt burned in my mind like an afterimage, impossible to erase. I let it go too far. I should have stopped it before it even started. Should have drawn the line, should have kept things normal. But instead, I had hesitated. And Ethan saw it, felt it. I shut the garage door and locked it, as if that would somehow shut out the thoughts clawing at my mind. But even as I turned off the lights and walked back into the house, the silence was deafening. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't think about it. I'd go about my routine, run errands, answer emails, do anything but replay the moment over and over. But avoidance only worked for so long. By mid-afternoon, I found myself glancing out the window toward the house next door, scanning for any sign of Ethan. Nothing. No car in the driveway. No movement behind the curtains. I told myself it was for the best. If he was avoiding me, it meant he regretted it too. It meant we could pretend nothing happened, move on, let things settle back into what they were supposed to be. But that logic fell apart when I stepped outside later that evening to take out the trash, because he was there, sitting on the front steps of his house, arms draped over his knees, gaze locked on the ground. He hadn't noticed me yet. I hesitated. I could go back inside, pretend I hadn't seen him, avoid the inevitable conversation. But before I could decide, Ethan looked up, and the second our eyes met, something twisted inside me. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, like he was waiting for me to say something. I cleared my throat. "Hey." A long beat passed before he nodded. "Hey." His voice was different. Not cold, not angry, just distant. I shifted on my feet. "Didn't see you earlier?" "Yeah." He exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand through his hair. "Was out." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. We were never awkward, never strained. But now it felt like we were standing on either side of a fault line, the ground between us unstable, one wrong step away from breaking apart completely. I wanted to fix it. I needed to fix it. But how? How do you go back after a moment like that? After something so unspoken yet undeniable? Ethan stood abruptly. My pulse spiked. "Ethan." But he was already stepping past me, moving toward his front door. Before he disappeared inside, he stopped. Just for a second. Then, without turning around, he muttered, "Forget it." The same words he had said last night. But this time they sounded different. Final. And as his door clicked shut behind him, I felt something sink deep inside me. Something unsettling. Because for the first time since I'd met Ethan, I had no idea what he was thinking. The silence between us stretched longer than it ever had before. For the next few days, Ethan was different. He wasn't avoiding me, not exactly. He still came outside, still moved around like nothing had changed. But that was the problem. Everything had changed. Before, he would always find an excuse to come over. A broken tool, a random question, some excuse to linger a little longer than necessary. Now, nothing. No quick glances. No small smirks. No easy conversations. Just distance. And I hated it. I told myself it was for the best. That I had done the right thing by not crossing a line. That if we just gave it time, things would settle. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had already crossed the line. The moment I hesitated, the moment I let the tension hang between us, I had changed something. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was done waiting for me to figure it out. Then it happened. It was late. The house was quiet. I had just stepped out onto the back porch, a cold drink in my hand, trying to shake the feeling that had been gnawing at me for days. Then I heard it. A knock. Not at the front door. Not even at the garage. At the side door. The one only a handful of people ever used. My stomach tightened. For a second, I thought about ignoring it. Pretending I hadn't heard. Pretending I wasn't home. But some part of me already knew who it was. I stepped toward the door, hesitating only a moment before unlocking it and pulling it open. And there he was, Ethan, standing in the dim glow of the porch light, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw tight with something unreadable, something unresolved. I swallowed hard. "Ethan." He stepped inside before I could finish, brushing past me. His presence filled the space instantly, crackling like static in the air. I turned to face him, my pulse unsteady. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step closer. Not hesitant this time, determined. My breath caught. Then finally he spoke. "I'm done pretending." A heavy pause. A slow, creeping realization. Before I could react, before I could process the shift in his voice, his body language, the sharp intensity in his stare, he reached for me. And just like that, everything changed.